from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. We have a special program here, the Australian Special Forces Secrets. It was exposed by some journalists from the Australian Broadcast Network, ABC, and very interesting situation. Nothing, of course, happens in a vacuum, period. This is Boston Red from the Jerry Pippin Memorial broadcast booth here on the 6th of June 2019. This is a very interesting story. We originally started to do a package on the Australian elections, and this is where we will start. For those that recall those elections, the projection was that that Labour would win the election. That was the projection there, and it did not turn to fruition. We did not model the Australian election, but in the past we have looked at elections in Australia, and those elections are very interesting. In fact, when they had a hung parliament there, one of the things to remember when we start talking about these elections as we had in the U.S. here in 2016, many of the posters and some of the models that came to an incorrect conclusion. The race between Hillary Rodham Clinton and DJ Trump. DJ Trump ended up winning the election. Stunned the nation, stunned the so-called pundits, talking heads, whatever you want to call them. Now in Australia, the polls had Labour winning there, and the so-called coalition, the Conservatives, losing out. In fact, it was a surprise to the Conservatives themselves that they pulled this election out. Well, what basically happened? We have not explored the elements of polling, and that's something that political scientists or psephologists, as we were called. Of course, in Australia, we are called psephologists, and we chose to use the term here. But nonetheless, many times there are groups that are overlooked. Are today, particularly in polling, not so much in modeling, but in polling, people don't tell the posters how they actually plan to vote. That's one of the big problems there. Now, there are other analytics we have, such as past voting patterns in a particular area, and are the current polls telling us something that did not happen before. Now, using AI, we can come to a little bit better conclusion. And there are other methods too. There's an Australian company that we looked at in 2016 that actually modeled the U.S. election correctly. So there's more than one source coming to the conclusion. The pollsters and even the so-called exit polls didn't predict what was going on. Thus, the right wing was able to form a government. And the reason we started with this particular situation was we wanted to give some background of why what has happened there did in fact happen. And that's the information. Let me just a second here. I need to do something here. Okay. And how the seats actually went. The coalition won 77 seats, and they needed only 76, and Labour had 68 seats that they had. So that was the problem within itself of what happened, how the National Party was able to win. I'm just looking at it here, and what some of the issues were, and we're having some of the same situations here, climate change, healthcare. In the U.S. election, healthcare has took a back seat as one of the framing issues. But again, if you look at some of these issues here, you start to see immediately what is going on here: taxes, immigration, education, industrial relations, and so forth and so on. And where these various parties came in here, and if you look at some of the margins here, and won't get into those because these are some of the areas of Australia. I think we have Queensland. We have a lot of them here, but anyway, this is just sort of basically an overview here of what happened. Basically, Labour fell 10. Let's see, about 9 seats short. Actually, let's see. They got 68, and you needed 76 to win. Now, remember, this is a parliamentary system, a little different system. And the coalition had 77, one more than what they actually needed, whereas Labour would have needed 8 seats to win, but it was a long ways away there. So this is the aftermath of the election. Let's go to the winner. Morrison coalition, close to shock majority was the headline here. This is out of the BBC. On the 20th of May 2019, the Australian Minister Scott Morrison is close to securing a majority government as the election final results counted, and they were leading with 77 seats. The Australian Election Commission said only 76 were needed. Exit polls had predicted a Labour Party win. And, of course, Morrison claimed he believed in miracles. He lied. But anyway, this is a situation there. And in his victory speech, it has been those Australians who have worked hard every day, who they had their dreams. They had their aspirations to get a job, to get an apprenticeship, to start a business, to meet someone amazing. That's what he said. To start a family, to buy a house. A typical kind of situation there. And Australia holds elections every 3 years. That's a little unusual. France, it's 5 years. In the U.S., it's every 4 years. But again, it's a parliamentary situation, and you can have a snap election. Now, he actually replaced Malcolm Turnbull, who was there at one time. So Turnbull disappeared, and there were fierce debates about the rolling leadership turmoil and the former recognition of Indigenous Australians, the Aborigines there in Australia. I think people have become afraid after a very negative campaign by Labour supporters. This is Julie Nelson told Reuters at the party's Melbourne election function. The Liberals, managed to convince people they should be afraid of change. Well, one of the issues that Australia is heavily dependent on mining, and the economy had not been doing well. But when you have this type of background, you start to understand what is happening there with press freedoms. Now let me go forward here to what happened with the ABC, that's the Australian Broadcast Corporation, and the raiding there over these Afghan fouls. The Australian Federal Police left the ABC office, that's the headquarters in Sydney, Australia, after a raid over a series that was done in 2017 known as the Afghan Files. The story by investigative journalists Dan Oakes and Sam Clark revealed allegations of unlawful killings and misconduct by Australian special forces in Afghanistan. They were based off of hundreds of pages of secret defense documents leaked to the ABC. The warrant named Oakes, Clark, and the director of news, Gavin Morris. They took things like thumb drives, USB drives, etc. Technicians password protected their files, and police will be unable to access those files until a 2-week period there. In other words, they were what we call in the software game cracking it. They entered the headquarters at 11:30, followed shortly thereafter by Free Police IT technicians. This is the AFP people that entered. Incidentally, I am coming from ABC here, and the date line on this was the 6th of June, actually. Okay. And it shows various things going on here. And the ABC's managing director said it was highly unusual for the national broadcasters to be rated in this way. Well, this is what happens many times with the election of this conservative government. We've seen the same thing happen in the U.S. here with the case of Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning, of course, was a military type, and she was able to literally take out DVDs loaded with information, and those DVDs later ended up at WikiLeaks. And now you have another Australian, Julian Assange, in jail in London. He's in a medical facility now. And what happened to him? Well, all of this knocks on the doors of journalists and freedom of journalists to report. Now, there was a lot of chatter in the 60s and 70s about a so-called freedom of the press in Western nations, as opposed to being in the USSR and various other places, China. Well, the situation is and has been in the U.S. for a very, very long time. If you go back to Dr. Daniel Ellsberg's case, they were going to get him under the same act that they want to get Julian Assange, the Espionage Act. That is something that came out of the early 1900s, during what was called a Red Scare at the time, and it is still around. And Chelsea Manning, they are trying to force her to testify before the grand jury, and she has steadfastly refused. And this is where the standoff in the U.S. is. In Australia, we don't know. We'll continue to report on this story as it develops. And to Morris, he's the ABC Director of News, who is named in the warrant, and said journalism is not a crime. We agree. Not linked to, the News Corp journalist home raid. Now, there's more on one side of this. Those raids came one day after the AFP executed search warrants at News Corp. This is News Corp's a journalist, Anika, I suppose you pronounce this, Summonfrost, who reported on the secret plan, to allow government spying. The AFP released a statement saying no arrests were planned on Wednesday, and the warrant was not linked to the search of executed in camera. Yesterday, the search warrant was related to allegations of publishing classified materials contrary to the provision of and this is the same situation here, the Criminal Act of 1914. This is about the time we had the Espionage Act here in America, across the pond, related to a referral received on the 11th of June 2017 by the Chief of the Defense Forces and the Acting Secretary of Defense, the statement said. A later statement from the AFP said the Home Affairs Minister Peter Dalton was not notified prior to these shenanigans. The AFP receives referrals, its assessments then for criminality, and does not make value judgments on the issue, instantly identifying whether it has been a controversy of the Commonwealth law. A contravestation of the Commonwealth law, when the evidence is as whether the offense has been committed or otherwise. So a little bit very, very legal here. The opposition Home Affairs spokesman Christina Kennedy said that Labor has requested a briefing on Dalton's situation there. Let me change. Why the raid on the Australian media presents a clear threat to democracy. This is on also the 6th of June. And this goes back to Simmerhurst. It stems from an article by Simmerhurst, a 2018 article which contains images of top secret memos and reported that senior government officials were considering moves to empower the Australian Signal Directory to covertly monitor Australian citizens for the first time. Soon after that, 2G radio presenter Ben Fordham revealed he had been notified by the Department of Home Affairs that he was a subject of a similar investigation aimed at identifying the sources of classified information he reported regarding the intercepted boat's arrival. Then on Wednesday, the raid at the headquarters in Sydney of ABC. The dynamic development was connected with the 2017 Afghan file report, hundreds of pages of secret defense force documents leaked to ABC. The New York Times quoted News Corp's description of Smithhurst's raid as a dangerous act of intimidation forwards of those who committed telling to district government from the AFP's action. The opposition leader here, Anthony Aberson, source of confidentiality. Upon finding out that he was subject to investigation and on covering the source of the government information, this has been Fordham declared the chances of me revealing my source is zero. The same stance as Chelsea Manning. Not today, not tomorrow, not next week, not next month. There's not a hope in hell that this is going to happen. Source confidentiality is one of journalists' most central ethic principles. It is recognized by the United Nations, and it is vital to the functioning of democracy and free, independent, robust, elective media. One of the greatest threats is source of confidentiality in Australia. Uniquely broad data surveillance framework, of the 2015 Metadata Act retention scheme requires that all metadata, that is data about a device or communication, but not say the communication itself, be retained for 2 years. Now, we don't have that in the States here. Reports suggest that by late 2018, some of the 350,000 requests for access to metadata were being received by telecommunication services. Now, this is when you use mobile phones and what have you, the metadata is there. We talked about this on the open source report. That's our technical open source presentation here at WBYR and on the Boston Red Network. We try to get everything coordinated as best we can to access a professional journalist's Metadata in order to identify a confidential source is permitted, provided that the access has a particular criminal investigation or enforcement purpose, and the agency can show it is in the public interest. In the U.S., we have what's called a FICA court. That's a special court where the Department of Justice, FBI, can go and get a search warrant to do basically the same thing, period. But in 2018, the government went some way to close down the option when they introduced complex and highly controversial telecommunication other legislative amendments, assistance and access acts. That was in 2018 under the right-wing government. After 2015, journalists were advised to avoid their use of mobile devices as source communications. They were also encouraged whenever possible to encrypt communications. We tell people to do that, advise, I should say, people to do that, using things like Tor, T-O-R, that network to encrypt what they have, and various other encryption devices we can have. Again, if you go to our open source report, we talk about this, those types of actions. In July of 2018, the government introduced a suite of new espionage, foreign interference, and security offenses. They include the offense of current or former Commonwealth officers communicating information obtained by virtue of their position likely to cause harm to the interests of Australia's interests. This offense is punishable by imprisonment for 7 years if the information is securely classified or the person has a security classification. They may have committed an aggravated offense and could be subject to 10 years. So in other words, it gets more punitive as you go. Protecting of media freedom. Australia has more national security laws than any other nation. It is also the only so-called liberal democracy. It's not backing a charter of human rights that would protect media freedom, though, for example, the right to freedom of speech and privacy. In this context, journalists are in a peculiar position, particularly journalists engaged in a public interest journalism. The journalism is vital to government accountability and a vibrant democracy. But there is a tense relationship with Australia's national interest as conceived by the government. In other words, the national interest can be basically what the government says it is. National security has severely undercut source confidentiality by increasingly and easing data surveillance. National security laws have also criminalized a wide array of conduct related to the handling of sensitive government information, both by the government offices and the general public. These laws are just a few parts of a much larger national security framework. Inclusion and control orders and preventive detention orders. Now, this is one of those things that this is akin to the grand jury that you have in the U.S. secret evidence, detention warrants, offenses of espionage, foreign interference, advocating and supporting terrorism, and more. So in other words, there's a broad sense that they can arrest one on. One of the most disturbing outcomes is not the prosecution or even the raids themselves, but the chilling of public interest. Journalism sources are less likely to come forward, no doubt about that, facing risks to themselves and a high likelihood of identification by the governmental agencies. And journalists are less likely to run stories following the risks posed to their sources and perhaps even to themselves. Against this background, the calls for the Media Freedom Act, such as by the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, have gained significant traction, and it may take this kind of bold statement to cut across the complexities of individual laws, and that's always been a case in civil rights, particularly in civil rights litigation, where you're forced to litigate case by case and individual problem by problem, and it's very difficult in the U.S. to come to a class action, and that is sort of akin to that particular situation. It may take the kind of, the future of public interest journalism in Australia. And this is basically the same things happening in the U.S., very, very chilling. At the time of the Pentagon Papers and Dr. Ellsberg, the breaking into his psychologist, was a different time in America. America was actually more progressive in the 70s. Had it happened today with our Supreme Court in the U.S., they may or may not have found for Daniel Ellsberg in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now, it's important to note when we get to the WikiLeaks papers that major newspapers in London, The Guardian, and the other newspapers in the U.S., the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many, many others, Washington Post, they all published the WikiLeaks files. So now their newspapers, their publishers, where do they relate to Julian Assange? If they can put Julian Assange in jail, other newspapers and broadcast medias had better watch out. You won't see these stories appearing unless it appears by someone that has the information. It is no longer with us. Then the information, it could be made available. You won't see the deep throats like you did in the Watergate situation, who was turned out to be an FBI official. You won't see those types of things, not in this atmosphere. And this is why we chose this story, not only in Australia, in the U.S., but in the U.K. and many, many other countries there, the neoliberal operations, like the U.S., Australia, etc. They tend to go to China, Tiananmen Square, and the action that happened there 30 years ago. But we don't need to go back 30 years there. And the criticism of how they address the press in, say, in China and many, many other countries, journalists, and not only as what happened to Mr. Khashoggi, invited in the embassy for tea and papers, and this is in Turkey, and ends up killed, dismembered, and the people in at the tops of the Saudi government that ordered it are still walking around Riyadh or wherever they are, and no one has been punished. Now, some people, yes, were indicted, and what did the U.S. say? Well, we got to deal with our monetary relationship with Saudi Arabia. They buy weapons from us, etc. Therefore, the journalist Shikozi, not pronounced his name correctly, Shikozi, who was actually with the Washington Post, also was a journalist that was killed. Reuters had some journalists in jail. They are now out of jail. But this is a saga of modern day journalists all over the world. It's not just an Australian case. This is a case of many, many people. We were going to pinch this. This is the Afghan files. Defense leaks exposes deadly secrets of the special forces. Hundreds of pages of secret Defense Force documents leaked to the Australian broadcast company. This is including incidents of troops killing unarmed men and children. I saw something on social media. They were talking about Brother John Kerry. John Kerry was a Secretary of State. He was a longtime senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and ran for president. And the SWIP voted him. And one of the comments was, well, he called other people that were in Vietnam, baby kills. Well, they did kill babies. They did kill children. That was the untold saga of the whole thing. Now, some of the leaked documents here expose deadly secrets, an interrogation, a shooting, and no witnesses. And this is number 3, what the document reveals about the killing of unarmed Afghanis. No doubt about that. The spy, the soldier with a loaded Glock, and many of the Artel, this is Australian eyes only open, suggest a growing unease at the highest level of the defense about the culture of Australian Special Forces as they prosecuted a bloody, secretive war against insurgents across a swath of southern Afghanistan. One document in 2014 refers to ingrained problems within the Special Forces and organizational culture, including warrior culture and a willingness by officials to turn a blind eye to poor behavior. This whole thing about warriors, and this is to the U.S., they now call these people warriors. They used to be called soldiers. We're not going back to the feudal dark ages and middle ages and wherever you want to go. Not only that, the so-called warriors mentality leaked into the training of ordinary coppers, police officers in the U.S., that they were warriors. What were they fighting? The Crusades? No, they were fighting a crusade against primarily people of color. Many African American males were bloodily executed by these people. Some were caught on camera, some were brought to internal affairs, some were not brought anywhere. They were never recorded as a police killing. This has been going on. You've had death squads and still have them in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, even in Nicaragua, some of the right wing. This is a toy of the right wing. These death squads in Chile, in Brazil, right wing thugs are running around. In the U.S., we have these white supremacist gangs that are running around killing people willy-nilly, is what happened to Heather Heyer, a campaigner for freedom in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we always honor her on Friday Jobber, and we invite you to listen to our program Friday Jobber. This is the same type of training that killed the Australian nationalist Justine Ruchek Damon in the Midwest city of Minneapolis. It does matter how people are trained. People can be trained to be civilized people, to serve humanity, or they can be trained to be hyenas. Period. And you can throw the morality out. There's no morality in this type of thing, and this is where you can just forget about this. We tell people not to be petty moralizing and labeling these people moral or immoral. Forget about that. Just go by what their actions were. In the U.S., we had My Lai with Cali that was acquitted there. There's a long history. This is in Vietnam. Killing of little yellow people. That was our age. Remember Vietnam very vividly. But then they went on to Afghanistan and various other places that they were able to commit more atrocities than before. A high proportion of the documents are reported on, or at least 10 incidents between 2009 and 2013 in which Special Forces troops shot dead insurgents, but also unarmed women and children. The Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force is investigating at least 2 of the incidents as a part of an inquiry into the conduct of Australian Special Forces. 2 incidents which occurred in September of 2013 are the deaths of a man and his 6-year-old child during a raid on a house, as revealed yesterday by the ABC, and the killing of a detainee who was alone with an Australian soldier allegedly tried to seize his weapon. Now, this is the same thing on a story that we reported on that was related to this rogue cop that was at the scene of Justine Ruchek Demond's murder. A guy by the name of Daniel May. He effectively claimed the same thing, but there was a gun that obviously was an old gun, didn't work, planted there. Then we have another case of Jamal Clark, where he was supposedly grabbing for a police officer more current in Minnesota, also a police officer's gun. And they tried to say literally that Justine hit the car very loudly. Why would a woman hit the car? But there was no palm print there. Then they said, well, she used the back of her hand. Then they had the squirrel in the in the dumpster. I mean, they came with all sort of things. There was a fireworks scheme going on, and that the officer was fearful that his partner would be shot, which was an absolute lie. But this is the same type of behavior that is going on and on and on. And many of these people that are in this type of behavior come out of Afghanistan, the Baghdad war, and come back into the country. I don't know if someone is listening, if they have a percentage or numbers of Australian troops that are coming out of Afghanistan and coming back into Australia and joining various police forces. There's a large number of veterans in police forces across the U.S. from Afghanistan to Iraq to various other assignments along the way. Back in the day, we were looking at the so-called Great Generation, and then there was a long Korean War fought to the 36th parallel, and at the same time, we then went into something called Vietnam. The old-timers looked at it as nothing, as a joke. Now, Australian forces were also in Vietnam. Rally around the flag, boys. Rally around the flag. Doesn't matter which flag, but they had the Aussie flag, they had the American flag, the Canadians were there, and various others were rallying around the flag, so to speak. And after that was over, these actions in, particularly Afghanistan, so-called NATO forces there, to get in all these old powers, and then invite in Australia, I guess, through the Commonwealth. The UK was there, and I believe many of these forces are out. Let me just finish this up here. The documents also provide fresh details of some notorious incidents, including the severing of hands. They literally cut off the hands so they could get the fingerprints. Report shows that the federal Liberal Party MP Andrew Hastie, then an officer and commander of the soldier who cut off the hand, immediately expressed alarm about what happened and reported the incident to the chain of command. The incident caused a tension between the SAS and the Australian Defence Forces, no doubt. Another letter sent in 2013 by a senior officer of two commanders to the chief of the Army, David Morrison, exposes the rip between the SAS and two commandos. I'm trying to, somewhere here when you're running very, very quickly, whom the SAS was. The SAS is based in Perth. This is where the SAS is here. So anyway, we'll just roll on here. And interrogation is shooting and no witnesses. Well, that happens more than not. The spy and the SAS, a soldier with a loaded Glock. I think we talked a little bit about that. And we'll put pins this where you can read it further along, and people in Australia probably have already read it, but we want a Special Air Force Service Regiment. Okay, that's what they are. is a special air service regiment, and the 2nd Commando Regiment are Australian Special Force elite. The soldiers are tasked with the most difficult missions in war zones like Afghanistan. I guess they would be on line with the SEALs in this country, are various other special rangers, a type of army units that are light, heavy, and are trained in these type of maneuvers there. So anyway, we will pinch this along, and let's see. We did see someplace bring you up to date on the cricket matches. I'm not sure we can do this, but I believe Australia came out on top of these various. I'm not batting 100 here right now, so it's just, we're having some technical difficulties here, and we'll have to end this, no doubt, where we are right now. Where we are. We're not going. Let me see if we have overcome. Well, maybe we have overcome some of our problems here. We'll see if we get to cricket scores. We may not be able to get to cricket scores. We're sorry about that. The U.S. we're not a big cricket country here, no doubt about it. That's UK, Australia, India, very big in India. We were looking at Telesur, and they had the cricket scores there. But now, in terms of sport, you're seeing more and more sports that are reported worldwide. Actually, we should be going to the BBC here. That is where the cricket scores would be. And I'm not certain how we do that. The BBC has a new format. And, here we go. This is Cricket's World Cup. Australia beats West Indies to take the Kota now. I'm not sure what that is. Anyway, I guess I can give the scores. Australia 288, that is 49 over. And the West Indies at 273 and 9. Maybe that's wickets there. Won by Australia by 15 runs. Anyway, at least you got a sports report. We'll have to work on cricket there and a little bit more about that. But we do have a program called All About Sports, and we're not reporting on cricket. We're covering in the U.S. what's called the Stanley Cup. The Boston Bruins and St. Louis Blues are involved in it. And we'll have more about it. Incidentally, tomorrow morning, Friday morning, we have Friday Jobber here on WBRN Radio and the Boston Red Network. Invite you to check in there. And if you have smart speakers, just say Boston Red and we'll pop up. We're on, incidentally, Spotify. President Obama just joined the lineup on Spotify. We're on iHeart. You can get us on iHeart, Stitcher, sorry about that, not Snitcher, Stitcher, and you can also find us on Spreaker, Spreaker. You can get us in Italy and various other countries. And there are too many channels out there. YouTube, you can find the audio version there, and also you can find us on Twitter. We're on the Boston Red Twitter feed. On Facebook, we're all over the place. Nonetheless, this has been the secrets of the Australian Special Forces. We're working still on the title, but we'll get it on the way. We'll get it done. Good day.